January 1944. High above western Germany, the air is thin and metallic cold. Sunlight glints off aluminum wings at 25,000 feet. Vapor trails stretch across the sky like chalk lines, marking the paths of men who cannot see the ground below, only each other. A formation of German fighters climbs confidently toward approaching American bombers. Veterans at the controls. Hundreds of missions between them. They have seen every escort the Americans can offer. Heavy. Short-legged. Predictable. Then something unfamiliar slides into view: slim wings. Long nose. Clean lines. Not the bulky Thunderbolt. Not the temperamental Lightning. The German pilots roll closer, curious rather than alarmed. Some waggle wings. One pilot later recalls the assumption spreading through the formation, that these new fighters must be weak, maybe inexperienced, maybe desperate. The confidence is casual. Almost playful, but the distance closes faster than expected. The unknown escorts do not turn back. They do not fall behind the bombers, they press forward, silent, controlled, waiting, and in those few seconds of misjudgment, the balance of the air war begins to shift, setting the stage for a confrontation born from overconfidence and paid for in flames. By the winter of 1943, the daylight air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. The United States Army Air Forces had committed fully to a doctrine many considered reckless: precision bombing in broad daylight, deep into enemy territory, without fighter cover for most of the journey. The theory was built on confidence in tight bomber formations, overlapping fields of fire, and the belief that massed .50 caliber guns could protect themselves. On paper, it looked convincing. In the skies over Germany, it proved catastrophically optimistic. The 8th Air Force flew from bases carved into the English countryside, East Anglia fields where concrete runways cut through farmland and fog. From there, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators climbed slowly, heavily loaded, forming long, vulnerable streams that stretched for miles. Once they crossed the channel and pushed beyond the reach of escort fighters, they entered what bomber crews called the lonely sky. The Luftwaffe understood this geography of vulnerability perfectly. German radar stations tracked bomber streams early. Fighter controllers plotted intercepts with precision, feeding vectors to waiting squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s. These were not inexperienced pilots. Many were veterans of Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the Eastern Front. They knew where American escorts turned back. They knew how long bombers had to fly unprotected. And they attacked accordingly. Throughout 1943, German fighters tore into unescorted bombers with disciplined brutality. Head-on passes shattered cockpits. Cannon shells ripped through aluminum skin. Entire formations disintegrated in minutes. On missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, American losses climbed to levels that threatened the entire bombing campaign. Aircraft came back riddled with holes, or not at all. The escorts available to the USAF were simply not enough. The P-47 Thunderbolt was fast, rugged, and deadly at high altitude, but its range was limited. Drop tanks extended its reach only so far. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning offered promise but suffered from reliability issues in the cold, thin air over Europe. Both fighters had to turn back before the bombers reached their deepest targets. German pilots learned this rhythm. They waited. They watched the escorts peel away. Then they struck. By late 1943, Luftwaffe confidence in daylight interception had hardened into routine. Bomber streams were targets, not mysteries. German pilots joked about American predictability, about knowing the sky better than the enemy who flew through it. The war in the air, at least for the moment, still felt controllable, but beneath that confidence, pressure was building. Aircraft production strained. Pilot losses mounted. Fuel grew scarce. The Luftwaffe needed victories not just tactically, but psychologically, to prove it still ruled the skies over the Reich. And into that fragile balance, something new was already crossing the Atlantic. The aircraft that would unsettle the Luftwaffe had not been born from American urgency, but from British necessity. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a simple request: build more fighters, quickly. What emerged was not an immediate war winner. The early Mustang was fast at low altitude and aerodynamically clean, but at higher levels, where Europe's air war was being fought, it struggled. Its Allison engine simply could not breathe thin air. For a time, the aircraft remained a curiosity. Everything changed when British engineers fitted the Mustang with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. With a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the Merlin transformed the aircraft. High-altitude performance surged. Speed increased. Climb improved. Range expanded beyond anything American fighters had previously fielded. When Packard began producing the Merlin under license in the United States, the transformation became scalable. The P-51B and later P-51D emerged not as experiments, but as fully realized weapons, designed for the specific demands of the European theater. What made the Mustang truly disruptive was not a single characteristic, but a combination the Luftwaffe had never faced at once. It could fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin, and stay. It was fast enough to choose when to fight. It climbed well enough to dictate altitude. It turned tightly at speed. And with external drop tanks, it could loiter, hunt, and wait. This was not immediately understood by German intelligence. Early reports described the Mustang as a reconnaissance aircraft or a marginal escort. Its sleek profile led some pilots to assume it was lightly armed or fragile. Compared to the heavy Thunderbolt, it looked almost delicate. Against seasoned Luftwaffe veterans flying proven interceptors, the new fighter did not inspire caution. Operational deployment began in earnest in late 1943. The 354th Fighter Group was among the first to take the Mustang into combat, initially attached to bomber formations to evaluate its escort performance. Results were immediate and unsettling. For the first time, German pilots encountered escorts that did not turn back. Escorts that followed them into dives. Escorts that stayed on their tails through extended engagements. Escorts that reappeared when German pilots believed the fight was over. The Luftwaffe's familiar rhythm began to break down. Interceptions grew messier. Timing slipped. Bomber formations that should have been exposed were suddenly shielded at the most dangerous moments. Loss reports became harder to explain. Encounters that began confidently ended inconclusively, or worse still, habits die slowly in war. Many German pilots continued to approach the Mustang with the assumptions formed from years of success. They believed experience would compensate for novelty. That skill would overwhelm unfamiliar machines. That mockery, even if unspoken, was justified. Those assumptions would be tested not in theory, but in seconds, when misjudgment met reality at closing speed, and it was in one such encounter that overconfidence turned fatal. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was living on borrowed confidence. The pilots climbing into Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over Germany were not amateurs. Many had survived years of attrition, men who had watched friends disappear into fireballs and still returned to fly again. Survival bred skill. Skill bred belief. And belief, over time, hardened into certainty. They had learned patterns. American escorts came and went. Bombers pressed on alone. Interceptions followed a script that rewarded patience and experience. When something new appeared, instinct told them it could be measured, tested, dismissed. The Mustang's appearance triggered curiosity more than fear. Its narrow wings and smooth fuselage looked almost civilian compared to the brutish profiles of other American fighters. Some pilots assumed it sacrificed protection for speed. Others believed its pilots were inexperienced, rushed into combat to fill gaps in escort coverage. The idea that this aircraft represented a doctrinal revolution had not yet taken hold. In aerial combat, assumptions last only seconds. But those seconds matter. The P-51's true advantage was not raw speed or firepower alone, it was freedom. With 6.50 caliber machine guns, it matched the lethality of other American fighters. But unlike them, it carried that firepower deep into enemy territory without exhaustion. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag. The Merlin engine maintained power at altitude. Fuel efficiency allowed pilots to think beyond survival and focus on control. German pilots quickly discovered a problem: the Mustang did not behave as expected. It did not break off when pressed. It did not lose energy in extended turns. It did not struggle in the climb where earlier escorts had faltered. Attempts to lure it downward or draw it away from the bombers failed. The aircraft simply stayed, its pilots disciplined, patient, and alert. The greatest shift was tactical, not mechanical. American doctrine evolved alongside the Mustang. Escorts were no longer chained rigidly to bomber formations. P-51s were encouraged to range ahead, intercept attackers early, and engage aggressively. They were hunters now, not guardians tied to a defensive box. For German pilots, this shattered expectations. Interceptions that should have been clean became chaotic. Instead of striking bombers unopposed, they found themselves fighting for altitude and initiative. Escorts arrived sooner than anticipated. Disengagement became dangerous, not safe. The sky over Germany was no longer predictable. And in that growing uncertainty, a single encounter would crystallize everything the Luftwaffe had underestimated, when mockery met a machine designed not to retreat. While frontline pilots felt the shift first, Luftwaffe leadership was slower to adapt. By late 1943, Germany's air defense system was stretched thin. Fighter units were shuffled constantly, fuel allocations were rationed, and training pipelines shortened to replace mounting losses. Yet command assessments continued to underestimate the Mustang's impact. Reports described it as another escort, not a strategic rupture. This misjudgment mattered. Tactical doctrines remained focused on bomber destruction rather than escort neutralization. Interceptor formations were vectored toward bomber streams with little flexibility to account for aggressive fighter screens. The assumption was that escorts could be shaken off, as they always had been. When losses mounted during early Mustang encounters, explanations were often deflected downward: pilot error, bad weather, unlucky timing. Rarely was the aircraft itself acknowledged as the problem. That delay would prove costly. From the American cockpit, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. P-51 pilots noticed the change in German behavior before they saw it in reports. Fighters approached too closely. Held formation too long. Failed to disengage when energy bled away. There was a hesitation, brief, but fatal in air combat. Some American pilots later described German fighters circling, observing, almost sizing them up rather than striking decisively. That pause gave the Mustang what it needed: initiative. Once engaged, the balance flipped quickly. German pilots found themselves pursued through dives they assumed would guarantee escape. The Mustang followed. Attempts to climb away ended with tracers closing from behind. The psychological shock was not just being outperformed, but being hunted. Mockery in war is rarely spoken aloud. It lives in posture, in timing, in the decision to press or withdraw. When German pilots approached the Mustang casually, they were not laughing, they were assuming. Assuming superiority. Assuming control. Assuming experience would outweigh unfamiliarity. The Mustang punished those assumptions without emotion. Air combat does not allow second thoughts. Once speed, altitude, and position are surrendered, recovery becomes unlikely. In the span of minutes, confidence turned to confusion. Formation discipline collapsed. Survival replaced mission. 7 aircraft would be lost before escape became possible, and as smoke trails fell away beneath the clouds, the lesson became clear, not just to those who survived, but to the air war itself. The encounter did not end the Luftwaffe. But it ended an illusion. An illusion that would shatter fully in the moments when bullets met aluminum and the sky chose sides. The mission unfolded on a clear winter morning in early 1944, the kind of day both sides preferred for daylight war. American bomber formations crossed the German frontier shortly after mid-morning, engines droning in steady unison. Below them, broken cloud layers cast moving shadows over towns and forests. Above them, the sky was clean, perfect for interception. German radar stations detected the bomber stream early. Fighter units were scrambled with familiar urgency. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s climbed hard, engines straining, pilots rehearsing procedures they had executed dozens of times before. The plan was simple: engage after the escorts turned back, but the escorts did not turn back. As German fighters reached altitude, they encountered a screen of American fighters still in position, tight, disciplined, and waiting. Among them were P-51 Mustangs, their long wings glinting in the sun, holding station with the bombers instead of peeling away. The initial German reaction was hesitation. Pilots reported the unfamiliar silhouettes over the radio. Some moved closer to identify them visually. This was not caution, it was curiosity shaped by habit. The belief remained that these fighters could be tested, pushed, dismissed. The formations closed. At roughly 26,000 feet, the first merges began. German fighters rolled in, expecting resistance but not pursuit. They anticipated brief engagements, enough to disrupt escort cohesion before pressing toward the bombers. Instead, they met immediate aggression. Mustangs broke formation cleanly, not defensively but offensively. They climbed into the intercept, cutting across approach vectors, forcing German pilots to react earlier than planned. The sky, once orderly, fractured into intersecting spirals and crossing dives. Within seconds, the familiar geometry of interception dissolved. German pilots attempting to disengage found Mustangs already on their tails. Others discovered that diving away did not produce separation. The American fighters stayed with them, engines howling, closing the distance with unsettling ease. The engagement spread outward from the bomber stream, pulling German fighters away from their intended targets, and in that widening sphere of combat, the first aircraft fell, sudden, violent, irreversible, marking the moment when underestimation became consequence. The fight unraveled faster than anyone expected. Once momentum shifted, it did not swing back. German pilots who attempted to regroup discovered that radio traffic had become chaotic, overlapping calls, half-formed warnings, shouted vectors that no longer made sense in a sky filled with twisting contrails. Formation leaders tried to pull units together, but the Mustang had already disrupted cohesion. Every attempt to stabilize the fight was met by another American fighter dropping in from above. One by one, German aircraft were isolated. A Bf-109 rolled into a defensive spiral, hoping to bleed off its pursuer's energy. The Mustang stayed inside the turn. Tracers walked across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The aircraft snapped into a dive trailing smoke, disappearing into the cloud layer below. An Fw-190 attempted to disengage using raw speed. The pilot pushed the nose down, confident the heavier American fighter would fall away. Instead, the Mustang followed, steady and relentless. Gunfire flashed briefly. The Focke-Wulf erupted, fragments scattering in the slipstream. Altitude vanished. Time compressed. Within minutes, German pilots realized the bomber interception had failed. The bombers were no longer the center of the battle. Survival was. Pilots broke away individually, abandoning coordinated attack in favor of escape routes they had trusted for years. They did not work. Mustangs pressed the advantage with discipline, not recklessness. American pilots avoided low-altitude traps, choosing firing passes that maximized probability and minimized risk. The engagement became asymmetric, one side dictating terms, the other reacting. By the time the remaining German fighters managed to disengage, 7 aircraft were gone. Some pilots bailed out. Others never did. Wreckage burned unseen beneath the clouds. The sky above the bomber stream, once a killing ground, had been cleared. For the first time, German survivors fled not because fuel was low or orders demanded it, but because the fight had become unwinnable. The Mustangs reformed calmly. Bombers continued on course, and as the sound of combat faded behind them, the meaning of what had happened began to settle, quietly, inexorably, into the structure of the air war itself. The effects of the encounter were felt before the aircraft even landed. German pilots who returned to base filed loss reports that were difficult to reconcile. Engagement times were short. Outcomes were decisive. The number of aircraft lost did not match expectations for such a brief interception. There was no prolonged bomber engagement to justify the casualties. The explanation lay elsewhere, and it was uncomfortable. 7 fighters destroyed. No confirmed bomber losses from that engagement. For Luftwaffe units already operating under strain, this imbalance was alarming. Ground crews waited beside runways as damaged aircraft returned singly or not at all. Empty dispersal pads told their own story. Squadron commanders pieced together accounts from shaken pilots who described escorts that would not disengage, fighters that followed through dives and climbs alike. The language of reports shifted subtly. Where earlier assessments described enemy escorts as limited or temporary, newer reports emphasized persistence, speed, coordination. The Mustang's name began appearing more frequently, no longer as a curiosity but as a factor. On the American side, bomber crews noticed the difference immediately. Formations flew deeper into Germany with fewer losses. Interception windows shrank. Fighters that did attack were engaged earlier and pushed away from the bombers. Debriefings reflected a cautious optimism, something rare in the air war of 1943. Escort pilots, meanwhile, began to trust their aircraft completely. Confidence grew not from bravado, but from evidence. The Mustang had proven it could do what doctrine demanded: stay with the bombers, control the airspace, and survive. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. American pilots no longer felt like temporary guardians, they felt like owners of the sky, even over enemy territory. For the Luftwaffe, the realization cut deeper: the airspace above Germany was no longer safe. Familiar tactics no longer worked. Experience alone was no longer enough, and as new missions were planned, both sides adjusted, one with growing assurance, the other with narrowing options. The encounter had ended, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. What had happened in minutes over Germany began to reshape months of planning. For the Luftwaffe, the loss of 7 fighters in a failed interception was not catastrophic in isolation, but it was symbolic. It confirmed what frontline pilots were already sensing and what leadership had been slow to accept: the conditions of the air war had changed permanently. Interceptor tactics were revised, but under constraint. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less combat experience. Veteran leaders were increasingly forced to fly defensive missions rather than train newcomers. Every loss now carried weight beyond numbers. Attempts were made to counter the Mustang directly. Units experimented with heavier armament, head-on attacks against escorts rather than bombers, and concentrated strikes before American formations fully assembled. Yet each adjustment met the same underlying problem: the P-51 could choose when to fight and when to disengage. It denied the Luftwaffe the initiative it had relied on since 1941. Morale suffered quietly. Pilots no longer spoke casually about American escorts. Briefings carried a different tone. Warnings replaced assumptions. The certainty that once accompanied interception orders was gone, replaced by calculations and contingencies that acknowledged risk. For the USAF, the shift was profound. With long-range escort secured, daylight bombing became sustainable. Missions pushed deeper into the Reich with increasing regularity. Aircraft factories, fuel plants, and transportation networks came under relentless pressure. Loss rates, while still significant, fell to levels that could be endured. The Mustang's impact extended beyond protection; it enabled aggression. Escorts swept ahead of bomber streams, targeting airfields, catching German fighters during takeoff and landing, and further eroding the Luftwaffe's ability to recover. By mid-1944, the outcome was visible in the air: German fighters rose less often. Interceptions grew fragmented. American formations moved with a confidence that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The sky had become contested terrain. And then gradually, controlled space. The moment when German pilots underestimated the Mustang did not decide the war, but it marked the point when the Luftwaffe stopped dictating terms, and as the bombers turned for home, escorted all the way, the air war entered its final, irreversible phase, one that would demand reflection as much as reckoning. Air warfare has never been decided by a single aircraft, a single mission, or a single mistake. It is shaped instead by moments when belief collides with reality, when assumptions formed over years are undone in seconds. The encounter between German fighters and the P-51 Mustang was one of those moments. The Mustang did not announce itself with spectacle. It arrived quietly, methodically, and stayed where others could not. Its power lay not just in speed or range, but in what it denied the enemy. Certainty. German pilots had built their tactics on patterns that no longer held. Experience, once their greatest weapon, became a liability when it delayed recognition of change. For the Americans, the Mustang represented more than technical success. It restored faith in daylight strategy, in escort doctrine, and in the idea that control of the air could be achieved through persistence rather than sacrifice alone. It allowed bomber crews to fly with a sense of protection that had long been absent, and it shifted the psychological balance of the war long before Germany's defeat was sealed on the ground. The 7 fighters lost that day were not just aircraft. They were the visible cost of underestimation. In the sky, arrogance leaves no wreckage, but misjudgment does. And from that winter morning onward, the air over Europe belonged not to those who assumed dominance, but to those who adapted fastest when the sky changed.